Let's look at the latest in the Middle East, where Israel has resumed its bombardment of Gaza today after saying that Hamas had proved it was not serious about peace. Hannah Weisfeld joins us, Executive Director and founder of Yachad, a British Jewish organisation whose primary mission is to empower British Jews to support a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hannah, very good evening to you. A troubling day for many people, for many reasons. What's your take on what we've seen today?
Well, I think in some respects it's the inevitable. You know, as you say, there was a real sense of we'll never get past phase one. And I think that overnight we've seen a very dramatic end to the ceasefire in its entirety. But I would add that the context is incredibly important, that this kind of end of ceasefire has happened 2.5 weeks after the first phase was over, and they waited to break it. And Netanyahu has broken it as he's simultaneously trying to fire the head of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, and the Attorney General. And there is huge unrest in Israeli civil society about that. And this is a great distraction from that.
Well, just for people who aren't sort of familiar with the link between those events, Hannah, just explain it for us if you would. What is the connection between Netanyahu trying to fire Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, as you say, the fact the AG of Israel is trying to block it, and this sudden resumption of violence? What's the connection?
Well, prior to October the 7th and the war, there had been huge plans to overhaul and really undermine the independence of the judiciary in Israel. And the Israeli public had been protesting for 40 weeks solid against that. And October the 7th then happened, and this whole thing went on hold. What's happened since is that, first of all, the government has attempted to bring back this judicial overhaul. But they've also announced that the head of the Shin Bet announced a probe into Netanyahu's aides receiving funding from Qatar, and he didn't want that inquiry to happen. And so what's happened is that he has tried to fire the head of the Shin Bet, and the Attorney General has stepped in and said that's not legal, and he's also trying to fire her. And the entire thing is wrapped up within the war and the negotiations around the war and the relationship between Netanyahu and Qatar. But I would just add that something else which is crucially important that happened today is that Ben Kentish, who's one of the two most extreme ministers that was in the coalition, who left when the ceasefire was announced because he wanted the war to continue, has now rejoined the coalition today. And effectively, what Netanyahu has done is solidify his power around the war, while simultaneously trying to remove those who run other state institutions who he sees as undermining his power.
So the suggestion from the IDF and from the Netanyahu government that what they are doing was an inevitable consequence of Hamas refusing to release further Israeli hostages. Therefore, they say they had no option but to resume the conflict, resume the war. You say this is far more about Netanyahu's own political survival, Hannah.
Yes, and actually the Chief of Staff of the IDF has also been replaced by Netanyahu in the past month. And so the previous Chief of Staff was much more outspoken about needing to put the protection of the hostages at the forefront of the war aims. And the Netanyahu government didn't like that, and they got rid of him, and they've now replaced him with somebody who's much closer to the Netanyahu government. That's not to say, to be clear, that Hamas is in the right here, but in this particular instance, they have said that they will stick to the original ceasefire agreement and are willing to enter into stage 2 negotiations. And it's actually the Netanyahu government, with the backing of the Trump administration, who've said, no, we want to change what we agreed, and we want you to release more hostages, and if you don't do that, we will restart the war.
And for the hostages and their families, their loved ones, those that have fought so hard to bring those innocent people home and thought they were close to getting their loved ones back, or in too many cases the bodies of their loved ones back, this is a devastating blow.
It's completely devastating. There are 24 living hostages remaining in Gaza, 59 bodies, of which 24 are believed to still be alive. And those families have fought now for 17 months to bring their loved ones home. And there are demonstrations all over Israel all this evening, the whole day, with families of hostages literally running to the Gaza border, protesting against the resumption of the war, because they know that their loved ones are probably not going to come home if the war continues. And the hostage families have been incredibly outspoken about the need to end the war. alongside the majority of the Israeli public, who in the kind of around 70% of the public poll as being totally in favour of a negotiated permanent ceasefire and a hostage deal.
Yes, which seems further away than ever. Do you have any hope, Hannah, that this is a temporary blip? This is a flare-up in violence on a sort of longer road towards some sort of agreement, or far from
what
it?
Netanyahu said tonight was that there will only be hostage negotiations under fire. So he seems pretty sure that this is not a temporary blip. I think the caveat to that is, first of all, the pressure from the Arab world, which is a relatively new thing that, previously in previous conflicts, it's tended to be that America has taken the lead with the support of Egypt, with the support of Jordan. You now have a much more engaged Arab world who are much more vocal about what they expect the Trump administration to do. And I think the question becomes whether pressure can be brought to bear actually on the Americans, who will then bring it to bear on Netanyahu. But at the moment, it feels quite bleak.
Because it's just on that, finally, it's notable, isn't it, that the White House made very clear that Donald Trump was consulted before the resumption of violence and gave his approval to Netanyahu.
Yes, and it's Trump who said that, that they would open the phrase was the gates of hell on Hamas if they didn't return the hostages. I mean, I would just end by saying, and I think this is crucially important, that there is no basis in which either Israelis and Palestinians will ever be secure if the route out of this mess is to try and bomb each other into kind of non-existence.
Yes.
There are two peoples living on this piece of land, and they will only both have peace and security when both of them have peace and security. Well said.
Hannah, thank you very much indeed. Hannah Weisfeld, Executive Director, founder of Yachad, a British Jewish organisation that works to support a political resolution to the conflict in the Middle East.